And talk about joint service. A member of the Space Force has become the first Guardian to receive a service medal from the Coast Guard. The Guardian spent 3 weeks aboard the Coast Guard Cutter Healy in the Arctic. It's cold up there. For more on exactly what he was doing, that Guardian, Captain Henry Cho, talked with Tom Temin.
So I was there to monitor our experiment. So the Coast Guard offers slots on the Coast Guard Cutter Healy, that's the ship's name, to conduct experiments on board. And part of their primary mission is to do science along with diving and rescue qualifications. So they regularly host scientist parties. So we were just one of those parties. There were other researchers from NASA Naval Research Lab, also Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. So our experiment was ionospheric sounder. So we made measurements off of the ionosphere, which is an atmosphere layer that contains ions and electrons. We used an active antenna to transmit up, and then another antenna to measure the return signal, and that measures the strength of the ionosphere. And the reason that we care about it is because the ionosphere has radio properties, meaning we can bounce radio signals off of it. So that's relevant for communications, for both ground communications, so radio, but also space communications like SATCOM and GPS.
Right, so Space Force has dominion over the satellites, and you want to make sure the signals can get through all of the atmosphere, including the ionosphere, then.
Right, so because ionosphere has both the properties of electrons where you can bounce radio signals, it also introduces delay for like satellite communications. So we want to account for that. And part of the research that we're doing is to make measurements of the ionosphere to know when it's stronger or when it's weaker.
And this can't be done via satellite, looking at it from the top instead of the bottom?
No, so we don't know about how strong the ionosphere is in the Arctic region, and that's one of the reasons why we were on board the cutter to make measurements of the ionosphere.
And is the polar zone important because of the way the satellites orbit?
Well, the polar region is important for a number of reasons. One of it is like for polar orbits. Another reason is because of climate change and how the polar ice caps are melting, there's increased activity up in the polar region. And so we're also interested in monitoring that region.
Right, because Russia and everybody else is prowling around there too, and the United States needs to have a strategic presence and a reliable one, I guess, too, in the Arctic. Fair to say?
Right. There is increased activity from both Russia and China, both military and commercial.
And for the Space Force, you specialize in atmospheric characterization generally, correct?
Right. So I'm assigned to currently Air Force Base as a researcher, and a lot of the experiments that we run here is for atmospheric characterization. So we're looking at making measurements, not just the ionosphere, but also like the weather, both terrestrial and space weather. So how solar activity affects the atmosphere. So we're looking at both the atmosphere based on terrestrial and space weather.
We're speaking with Captain Henry Cho of the Space Force. And tell us about life on the cutter in the Arctic. These are not tiny little boats, they're good-sized ships. What was life like aboard there?
This was a Coast Guard Cutter Healy, which is, I believe, was one of their larger ships, but relatively to naval ships, I think it's relatively small. But life is generally very simple on board a cutter. You sort of just wake up, and so my duties were just to monitor and make sure our experiment was running okay. And that takes about 30 minutes out of my day. And so most of your time is really just keeping up with your health, because the demands of going out into the Arctic, both living in an enclosed area and then living, working, sleeping in an enclosed area where both like mold and bacteria may work, or the food progressively gets worse because all the fresh food runs out in the first half, and then the second half you're eating like processed and frozen foods. And then on top of that, some nights you don't get a good night's sleep because of heavy waters in the rocking of the boat, and also there's a foghorn that goes off like every 30 seconds to alert other ships to make sure that there's no collisions.
Yeah, sounds like a total joy aboard the Coast Guard cutter. But otherwise, the Coast Guard people were accommodating for you with a sister force, you might say.
Right, yeah, they regularly do these science missions. So I think it can host up to 50 scientists. And so there are a lot of other government and commercial partners that they offer seats to. But yeah, they do this all the time. They understand like the demands of like be on board. So they certainly make time for people to get their sleep in, and yeah.
Is there a treadmill and a set of weight room and that kind of thing on there?
Yes, there is, I guess, 2 gyms on board, but an interesting thing about treadmill is on like the ship, essentially the floor is always moving because of the heavy waters. And so like running on a treadmill is very interesting because you have to also balance yourself with the rocking waters.
Yeah, I've done it. It's even worse trying to stand on a Bosu ball and balance things when you're on a ship that's rocking in the ocean. Well, tell us about your career, how you came to be an atmospheric characterization specialist. That's my word, not yours.
So I commissioned into the Air Force in 2016 for officer training school, and that was after college. I did an undergrad in aerospace engineering, and I was picked up as an engineer to be in the Air Force. My first assignment was at the GPS program office, so that was overseeing production of GPS satellites. And then after that, I was picked up for graduate school at the Air Force Institute of Technology, and there I earned an engineering master's in electrical engineering. And then that was also the assignment that I transferred into the Space Force, just because I had a strong space background that it made sense to transfer over. And then now I'm stationed here at Air Force Research Lab, and I work as a researcher. My career field, they essentially grow either program managers or technical talent, and I tend to lean on the technical side of things. So that's how I ended up in this position.
And where will you have to go next on the surface to be able to measure the atmosphere?
Well, right now we're debating on whether we do another experiment again on Coast Guard Cutter Healy, and we're not entirely sure like what different thing we would do because we don't want to collect the same data over again. So we're discussing whether we would do the same trip again and what we would do differently.
Sure. And this time you would bring a fresh crate of oranges, all of your own, I suppose.
The voyage was about 40 days. And yeah, I suppose, yeah, it would last.
But you did get a medal from the Coast Guard or from the Space Force?
So it is a Coast Guard medal. I was looking for it in the shop here at Kirtland, and they don't offer it. So I'm glad to have the medal up in the Coast Guard base up in Alaska.
Yeah, well, maybe next time you'll cruise the Caribbean.
Right, yeah. I mean, the cutter does go in different parts of the world. I'm not sure if they would actually go through the Caribbean and maybe through the Panama Canal.
Well, that would be a trip too, I guess.
Space Force Captain Henry Cho is a recipient of the Coast Guard Arctic Service Medal. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. And take the Federal Drive anywhere. Subscribe where you get your podcasts.